The place was dead quiet. That's how it usually was between 2 and 5 in the morning at the 24-hour pharmacy off Eastern Avenue in Baltimore. I had the radio on low, some overnight AM talk show I wasn't really listening to, and I was working through a stack of insurance rejections that had piled up during the day shift. March 2022, rain on and off all week. The parking lot outside the front doors was slick and empty, except for my Civic and a delivery truck idling by the loading bay next door. I heard the automatic door slide open around 2:40. That part I remember because I glanced at the clock and thought, okay, either someone's got a sick kid or someone can't sleep and wants NyQuil. The guy who walked up to the counter was maybe 22, 23, tall, thin, wearing a gray hoodie with the sleeves pulled down over his hands. His hair was wet, not styled, just wet like he'd been walking in the rain for a while. He didn't have an umbrella, he didn't have a car that I'd heard pull up either. He put a folded piece of paper on the counter and slid it across without saying anything. I said, "Hi, how you doing?" the usual, and he sort of nodded, but didn't answer. I unfolded the script. It was for lorazepam, 2 milligrams, 90 count, 1 to 3 tablets by mouth as needed for anxiety, no refills. Written on a legitimate-looking pad from a family medicine practice up in Towson. The prescriber's DEA number was there, the address, everything filled in. The patient name on the script was his name, Kevin, 23 years old, address in Fells Point. I looked at it for a second longer than I probably should have. 90 tablets of 2 milligram lorazepam is a lot. It's not the kind of thing a family doctor throws at a young guy for panic attacks. That's a psychiatrist quantity, and even then, most psychiatrists start people on a smaller supply and see how they do. Family docs write for maybe 30, 60 at the outside, usually 0.5 or 1 milligram. I looked up. Just this tonight? Yeah. He was looking at the counter. Not at me, not really at anything. Just at the fake wood laminate around where I'd put the script. You been on this before? No, first time. I gave him a small smile and told him it'd be a few minutes. I had to run it through insurance and pull the stock. He nodded and stepped back from the counter and went to sit in one of the plastic chairs we have by the blood pressure machine. I took the script back to the bench. Here's the thing, most nights I would have filled it. On paper it was fine. Doctor exists, DEA, number checks, no early fill, no drug interactions on his profile because he had no profile with us. That last part was the first thing that nagged at me. He'd never filled anything at our chain before, and we're the biggest chain in the metro, so either he'd been using an independent, or he'd never had a prescription in his life, or the address on the script wasn't really where he lived. I pulled up the prescriber in our system. He was real. Dr. R, family medicine, been practicing in Towson since the late 90s, board certified. No flags in our internal system for suspicious writing patterns, but I had this thing sitting in me, just a low, dull kind of no. I went to the front of the bench where the camera couldn't quite see and pretended to be reading the script again. What I was actually doing was looking at Kevin. He was still in the chair, both hands in his hoodie pocket, shoulders down. He was staring at the floor tile between his sneakers, and he hadn't moved once in about 90 seconds. Then he did move. He reached up and rubbed his face, and I got a look at his eyes, and I knew. I don't want to say I knew what he was going to do, because I didn't, not for sure, but I knew the look. My uncle had that same look about a year before he died, and it wasn't from anything anyone could see on the outside. I went back to my bench. Now, the standard thing when a script feels off is you call the prescriber's office and verify. During business hours, easy. At 3 in the morning, you're calling an answering service, and half the time, the on-call doc doesn't call back for an hour, and by then, your customer is gone. But I wasn't going to call the number printed on the script. That was the other thing. The number on the script was a 443 area code, which was fine for Baltimore, but Dr. R.S office was in Towson, which is almost always 410. Not impossible. Doctors have cell phones. But combined with everything else, it was one more small thing. I pulled Dr. R.S office number from our medical database, the one we pay for, that gets updated from the state board directly. Different number, 410. I called it, got the answering service, told the woman on the line I was a pharmacist and I had a script from Dr. R that I needed to verify tonight. Tell him it wasn't an emergency for the patient, but it was urgent for me. She said she'd page him. While I waited, I fake typed at my computer. Kevin was still in the chair. 6 minutes. My phone rang. Dr. R sounded like a man who'd been asleep. I gave him the patient name and date of birth off the script and read him what was written. There was a pause. Then he said, very carefully, I have never had a patient by that name, and I don't write 90 of 2 milligram Ativan for anybody, ever. I said, okay. I told him I'd take care of it from here. He asked me if the patient was still in the store. I said yes. He said, please call the police, and please, if you can, keep him there. I hung up. Now here's the part I've thought about a lot since. I had a choice. I could have handed the script back and said, "I couldn't fill it, we can't verify, come back in the morning." He would have walked out into the rain and gone somewhere else, or gone home, or gone wherever he was planning to go. I would have been done with it. Instead, I picked up the phone and called 911, and I told them exactly what I had. Forged script for a sedative in quantity, patient on premises, appears calm, but I'm worried about his well-being. They said units were on the way. Keep him there if I could do it safely. Don't confront him. I walked back up to the counter. "Hey Kevin, sorry, there's a little hiccup with your insurance. Going to take me a few more minutes. You alright to wait?" He looked up at me. And this is the part that has stayed with me. He didn't argue. He didn't ask what the problem was. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Then he looked back down at the floor. I went back to the bench and pretended to work. My hands were shaking a little, but he wasn't looking at my hands. The cops took 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. 2 of them, a man and a woman, came in through the front doors, and one of them made brief eye contact with me, and I gave the smallest nod I could toward the seating area. They didn't rush him. They walked over and sat down, one on each side, and they talked to him low and slow for a while. I couldn't hear the words. He nodded a couple of times. At one point, he put both his hands over his face and kept them there. The female officer walked back to my counter and asked me quietly if I'd already called for medical. I said no, just you guys. She got on her radio. The ambulance was there in maybe 6 minutes. They didn't use the siren. They came in through the front like anybody else, and they talked to him too. And after a while, he stood up on his own and walked out with them. He didn't look at me. I don't blame him. The whole thing took less than half an hour from the moment he'd walked in. I filled the rest of my shift. 2 more customers between 4 and 6. A woman needing eye drops. A guy picking up antibiotics for his kid. Neither of them noticed anything about me. I don't think there was anything to notice. I didn't tell my wife when I got home. I didn't tell my manager. I filed the incident report the way you're supposed to, and I heard exactly nothing back for the next 4 weeks. Then, on a Tuesday in April, one of the day shift techs was making small talk while we did the handoff, and she said something about her cousin, who was an EMT, and how her cousin had been telling her about a run they did back in March, kid at our store, and how they took him to Hopkins, and he was still there for a while, but he was okay. He was going to be okay. I said, "Oh yeah?" She said, "Yeah, I guess he wrote it himself." The script? Off a pad he'd stolen from a doctor's office where he used to work reception. Cops figured that out pretty quick. I said, "Huh." I said, "That's crazy." I finished the handoff, and I clocked out, and I drove home, and I sat in the car in my driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. That was almost 3 years ago now. I still work overnights. Different store, same chain. I've filled thousands of prescriptions since then, and most of them are exactly what they look like. But every so often, somebody comes in at 3 in the morning and slides a folded piece of paper across the counter, and I take a little longer than I need to before I say anything. I found the plane in a shoebox before I found it in any archive. It was October 2018, and I'd been at the paper for about 6 months, mostly writing about the pipeline and school board fights and the occasional bear that wandered into someone's carport. My editor gave me a filler assignment for the Sunday section, Forgotten Alaska Aviation Stories, something light for the anniversary of the state's flight museum reopening. I picked a stack of names from a list at the state library and started calling old bush pilots and mechanics from the phone book. One of them was a guy called Owen, 70s, retired airframe mechanic, lived in a duplex off DeBar. When I asked about famous Anchorage crashes, he named the usual ones in a bored voice: the Japan Airlines cargo, the Reeve Aleutian, that Korean Air incident near Attu. Then he stopped talking, and I could hear him breathing into the receiver. "You mean the one in November," he said. I said I didn't know which one. He didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "Come over." I've got pictures. His kitchen smelled like cigarettes and coffee grounds, and something faintly like machine oil, the way old mechanics always seem to smell, no matter how long they've been retired. He put the shoebox on the table between us. Inside were maybe 40 photographs, most of them Polaroids, dated on the back in careful blue pen. November 14th, 1985. A hillside covered in fresh snow. A piece of a wing folded in on itself like tin foil. A tail section with part of a registration burned off, but you could read a partial, N7 something, then a smear of soot. In one photo, there was a man in an orange parka kneeling next to what looked like a seat cushion. Owen said that was him. He said the site was somewhere south of Eklutna, off the old power line road, and that he'd gone up there with 2 other men from his shop the day after it happened because the state troopers who cordoned it off were short-handed and needed extra hands to move debris. I asked which airline. He laughed once, a dry laugh with no humor in it, and said that was the interesting part. I went back to the newsroom the next morning and pulled the microfiche for November 1985. Our archive room is in the basement, one long fluorescent-lit hallway with metal shelves and a reader that hums when you turn it on. I read every issue of the daily news from the 1st of the month to the 30th. Nothing. No crash, no missing plane, no memorial. I checked the Anchorage Times, the Frontiersman, the Peninsula Clarion. I checked the FAA accident database and the NTSB, both of which are supposed to keep every American hull loss on record forever. Nothing at N7-anything in Alaska that month. Nothing that matched the photographs. I told my editor about it over coffee. He was a guy in his late 50s who'd been at the paper since the mid-80s, and he had that specific newsroom face, sunburned red year-round, glasses pushed up on his forehead like he'd forgotten they were there. He listened, nodded slowly, and said, "That's a rabbit hole. Do your aviation piece. Save the shoebox for later." I did the aviation piece. Then I went back to the shoebox on my own time. Owen gave me 2 other names. One was a woman called Marlene, who'd been a dispatcher at the old Merrill Field Tower. The other was a guy called Pete, a retired trooper. Marlene invited me to her house in Mountain View and made me sit at her kitchen table while she went through a photo album, page by page, until she stopped on a single Polaroid tucked behind a picture of her son at his high school graduation, same hillside, different angle. She'd been up there too, on the second day, with a friend from the FAA who wanted to see it before, in her words, they finished cleaning up. She said the word cleaning like it had quotation marks around it. I asked how many people died. She said she didn't know, but she'd counted at least 11 body bags laid out on a tarp on the ridge before the friend told her they should leave. I asked what kind of plane it was. She said it was a commuter turboprop, not one of the little ones. Something bigger, maybe a Metroliner or a Bandeirante. She couldn't tell because it was in pieces. I asked which company operated it. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's the part I want you to figure out." Pete was harder. He agreed to meet me at a diner on Northern Lights, and then didn't show up. I called him 3 times over the next week. On the 4th call, he picked up on the 2nd ring and said, "I don't want to be in a story, but I'll tell you 2 things, and then you don't call me again." He said he'd been assigned to the crash site on the morning of the 15th. He said by that evening he was told to write his report as a training exercise and file it under a different case number, which he did because he was 26 years old and wanted to keep his job. And he said the plane had a company name on the tail, and the company still exists, and that's all he was going to say. Then he hung up. I went back through the microfiche a 2nd time, looking for smaller signals. There was a cluster of obituaries in mid-November 1985 that didn't quite fit the usual pattern for the paper. 5 of them in the same week, for people between 25 and 60, all with phrases like "suddenly at home" or "after a brief illness," all with services held out of state. Could have been nothing. I marked it in my notebook anyway. I spent 3 weeks after that trying to match the partial registration to a fleet list. There were 4 commuter operators flying out of Anchorage in 1985, with aircraft in the N7 range. 2 had gone out of business by 1990. 1 was still around, rebranded twice, now flying charters out of Ted Stevens. Their public fleet history had a gap. Between October 1985 and February 1986, one of their aircraft, a Fairchild Metro II, was listed as removed from service, reason not reported. No accident file, no sale record, no scrap disposition, just gone. I drove out to the site in mid-November, exactly 33 years later, plus a day. Owen had drawn me a map on the back of a diner menu, with landmarks like Big Split Birch and Old Rusted Culvert. It was a Saturday, the first real snow of the season, maybe 4 inches on the ground, and coming down soft. I parked at a pullout past the reservoir and walked in, along an old service road for about 40 minutes. My boots made a quiet crunching sound, and everything else was silent, in the way only heavy snow can make a place silent. The hillside in the Polaroids was gentler than I expected, more of a slope than a mountain, spruce coming back on the old burn scar, but not all the way. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I thought maybe I'd find nothing, and that would be its own kind of answer. I found a piece of aluminum skin about the size of a laptop, half buried under moss, with 2 rivet holes and a strip of pale green paint along one edge. I found what looked like a bent hydraulic line maybe 3 feet long, tangled in the roots of a fallen spruce. And on the way back to the road, near a stand of birch, I found a shoe, a woman's shoe. Leather, low heel, the sole cracked but the stitching still holding. The kind of thing you'd wear on a short flight if you were going to a meeting in town. I left everything where it was. I took pictures with a real camera and with my phone, and I noted the coordinates in the notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. I wrote the article over the next 2 months, 6,000 words. I had Owen and Marlene on the record. I had Pete on background. I had the fleet gap, the photographs, the coordinates, the shoe. I gave it to my editor on a Thursday morning in January, and he read it in his office with the door closed. When he came out, he sat on the edge of my desk and said, "This is good work. This is really good work, but it's too early." I said I didn't understand what that meant. He said, "It's too early. That's what it means." He said I could take it somewhere else if I wanted, but he wasn't running it in his paper, and he'd appreciate it if I didn't put his name on any of it. I took it somewhere else. I pitched it to a magazine in Seattle, to a long-form site out of Portland, to 2 national aviation publications, and to a true crime podcast that was doing an Alaska season. The magazine passed without a note. The long-form site had it for 6 weeks, and then the editor stopped answering my emails. The aviation publications both wrote back within a day, saying it wasn't a good fit for their readership. The podcast producer told me on a phone call that she loved it and would get back to me by the end of the month, and then she never did. And when I called her office a month later, they said she'd moved to a different show at a different company. The story is still on my computer. I've reread it maybe 20 times. It holds up. The reporting is clean, the sourcing is real. I don't know what too early means, and I've stopped trying to guess. Owen died in 2021 of a heart attack in the same duplex on DeBar. Marlene is still alive. I called her last spring, and she remembered me right away, remembered every detail we talked about, told me her granddaughter was starting at the university in Fairbanks. I asked her, carefully, if she'd ever be willing to go on the record again for a different outlet. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Honey, I already told you what I saw. That was my part." Then she asked about my mother, and we talked about other things for 20 minutes. Pete is still a name in the phone book. I called him once, 2 years ago, just to see if he'd pick up. He did. I said who I was. He said, "I remember you." I asked if anything had changed. He said, "Nothing's changed. Nothing's going to change." Then he said, not unkindly, "Don't call me again," and he hung up. For a while, I thought about mailing the article to national desks anonymously, or leaving copies of the shoebox photographs on somebody's porch. I never did. I don't think that was fear exactly. It felt more like understanding something without knowing what. I still drive out past the reservoir sometimes, in the fall, when the light is good. I don't go up the service road anymore. I don't need to. I know it's there. I'd been covering the crime beat for the Herald for about 2 years when the burglaries started. October 2017. Small town in southern New Mexico. The kind of place where crime beat mostly meant DUIs and Saturday night bar fights out at the Broken Spoke. So when houses started getting hit clean, no broken glass, no prints, always mid-afternoon, always when the owners were at work, it was actually a story. My source at the department was a guy I'll call Ray. He'd been feeding me tips for maybe a year. Small stuff at first. A DA who wouldn't return calls. A sheriff's deputy who kept getting reassigned instead of fired. That kind of thing. Ray liked me because I'd written a piece on a cousin of his that the paper had gotten wrong the year before, and I'd made them run a correction. Ray never called. He texted from a burner, always short. Sometimes it was just an address and a name. The first tip about the burglaries came on a Wednesday. Camino Vista, 400 block, hit last night. I drove out, and sure enough, sheriff's cruiser in the driveway, an older couple on the porch, looking stunned. Missing, 2 hunting rifles, cash out of a jar in the kitchen, a laptop. I got a quote from the wife and filed it. The next week, another tip, another address, a rental off Cottonwood, place hit while the tenants were at work. Big screen TV, some jewelry, prescription pills. By the third one, I'd built a little map on my desk at home, push pins in a printed satellite photo. All within about 4 miles of each other, all daytime, all when the house was empty. Ray was quicker than the official press release every time. Sometimes I'd get his text before the deputies had even finished at the scene. That was normal for him. He was inside. He heard things on the radio. Then in the second week of October, something changed. I was at Sophia's, a diner off the main highway that stays open till 2. It was maybe 11 at night. I was eating green chili fries and reading over notes with the radio playing something Spanish and slow from behind the counter. My phone buzzed on the vinyl of the booth. 1815 Alameda, between 2 and 4 tomorrow. I read it 3 times. Not hit yesterday, not hit tonight. A time window in the future. I typed back, "How do you know?" He didn't answer. The next afternoon, I drove out to Alameda anyway. I parked half a block down from 1815, a beige stucco place with an old swamp cooler on the roof, and sat with a warm bottle of water and my phone in my lap. Around 2:40, a white pickup pulled into the driveway. A guy in a gray hoodie got out, walked to the side gate like he owned the place, and disappeared behind the fence. He was inside maybe 12 minutes. When he came back out, he had a duffel bag that hadn't been there before. He drove off north on Alameda toward the interstate. I wrote down the plate on the corner of a receipt. I sat there another 10 minutes, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to figure out what I'd just done. I didn't call it in. I told myself I needed to know how Ray knew first. If I called dispatch, whoever was in the room with him would hear about the tip, and Ray would burn. That was the reasoning at the time. Honestly, part of it was also that I had a scoop, and I didn't want to hand it over yet. I texted Ray, 1815 got hit. You were right on the window. I know, he wrote back. Then nothing for the rest of the night. The next tip came on a Sunday. Elman 12th, corner house with the blue door, Tuesday morning hours. I went. Tuesday morning, I watched the same white pickup drive past the corner twice, slow, then parked 2 streets over. A different guy got out this time, older, wearing a phone company polo shirt with the logo peeled off. He walked up to the blue door, knocked, waited about a minute, then went around back. Inside 7 minutes, out with a backpack. Walked, didn't run. I sat in the car until my hands stopped shaking. Back at the paper, I told my editor I had a lead on a possible ring, that I was building towards something bigger, and I needed a couple more weeks before I filed anything real. He was a tired guy who liked page views and didn't ask a lot of follow-up questions. He said, fine, don't get shot. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I went back through every one of Ray's texts about the burglaries, the addresses, the time windows, all of it. I put it in a spreadsheet, printed it, and stared at it on my kitchen table with a glass of cheap red going warm next to me. Ray had never been wrong, not once. Not by a house number, not by an hour. I opened a new message to him. I typed and deleted it 4 times. What I finally sent was, Ray, how do you know before it happens? Don't tell me radio chatter. Tell me for real. Read. No reply. 2 days went by, then 3. On the 4th day, I drove past the department around lunch and saw his personal car in the lot, the tan Cherokee he'd had forever, so I knew he wasn't sick and wasn't dead in a ditch somewhere. He was just not talking to me. On day 5, I got a text. Because I planned them, and you're the only one who knows. I read it standing in the produce aisle of the Albertsons on Main. There was a woman next to me squeezing avocados and humming along to whatever was on the store speakers, some country song about a truck. I stood there holding my phone until she looked over at me funny and moved her cart down the aisle. I walked out without buying anything. At home, I locked the door behind me, which I usually didn't bother with, and sat on the kitchen floor for a while with my back against the cabinets. Not crying, just sitting. The thing that scared me wasn't him. Not exactly. Ray was a guy in his 50s with a bad back and a limp from an old accident. If Ray showed up at my apartment, I could probably outrun him to the car. What scared me was that he'd typed those words from inside a building full of people with guns and badges who thought he was one of them. He'd been sending me evidence for weeks, and I'd been printing it out and using it and thanking him for it. And there was the other thing, which was that he'd told me. He didn't have to tell me. He could have kept feeding me tips forever, and I would have kept writing them up. He wanted me to know. I still don't like thinking about why. I didn't answer him. For the next 2 days, I acted normal at work. I filed a piece about a school board meeting. I went to the gym once. I picked up dry cleaning I'd been ignoring for a month. The whole time I was making a list in my head of what I had and what I didn't. What I had. Every text from Ray, going back a year, backed up in 3 places. A pattern. Time-stamped stories in the paper that lined up with his tips, my own eyes on 2 of the jobs, a partial plate on the white pickup. What I didn't have, anybody at the department I could trust. Ray had told me himself, over coffee once, that half the shift supervisors would cover for each other before they'd cover for a civilian. He'd said it like a warning about someone else. Now I wondered how long he'd been getting me used to that idea. I called the district attorney's office in the county seat an hour north. I didn't say what it was about on the phone. I just said I was a reporter with the Herald, and I had material I needed to bring in person to somebody in public integrity. They gave me an appointment for the following Monday. I printed everything. 2 copies. One I put in a manila envelope in my glove box. The other I gave to my sister in Las Cruces on Saturday, sealed, with instructions not to open it unless I stopped answering the phone for more than a day. She asked me if I was in trouble. I said no, I was being careful. She looked at me like she didn't believe me and put the envelope in her closet anyway. Monday morning, I drove up. The DA's investigator was a woman about my age, quiet, took a lot of notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked me twice if I'd told anyone at the department. I said no. She asked if I'd responded to the last message. I said no. She asked me to leave my phone with her for a couple of hours so their tech could image it. I said okay. I sat in a waiting room with vending machine coffee and a 2-year-old copy of New Mexico magazine while they did whatever they did. When she came back, she thanked me. She told me not to contact Ray, not to drive past the department, not to write a word about this yet. She said the office would open a case that afternoon. Ray was put on administrative leave within the week. The official line was, pending an internal review. The paper ran a short item about it, which I did not write, because my editor by then knew enough to keep me off it until things settled. The investigation took most of a year. 2 other officers ended up named in it. Some of what came out was worse than what I'd handed over. Ray took a plea in the end. I don't know what he got. I made a point of not looking. The corruption piece ran the following fall, once the case closed and legal cleared it. It was the longest thing I've written. It won a small regional award, which I don't put in my email signature. I still work at the Herald. I still have sources at the department. New ones. Careful ones. When my phone buzzes late at night, I look at it a second longer than I used to before I pick it up.